Hi everyone, I'm Ariel Celia, behavioral scientist, recovering academic, and now a consultant in tobacco harm reduction. My disclosures are on the screen, but this is my personal channel and it's not funded or overseen by my employers or clients. The gateway hypothesis is essentially what helped me change my mind and see the light in tobacco harm reduction. Prior to that, as I'll talk about in this video, I was in academia for 10 years and kind of completely bought into the mainstream public health message at the time. But Gateway is very personal to me because it not only helped me along the career track that I'm in now, but I'm really familiar with it and have a deep expertise of the arguments for and against it. Starting out at a high level, what is the Gateway hypothesis? You might have heard this originally, like I did, in the form of marijuana or cannabis, where it was thought that cannabis use was a gateway to harder drugs, and the literature at the time supported this using pretty much the same type of evidence that we'll talk about today. The evidence for the cannabis gateway was that kids who used cannabis were more likely to go on to use other harder drugs, but that's no longer really taken seriously in the field. Nevertheless, we're rehashing the same types of arguments with e-cigarettes today. So currently, one of the supposed harms of e-cigarette use is that they could act as a gateway to cigarette smoking among adolescents. And that's become a talking point that's repeated so often and without citation or kind of critical evaluation that many people believe it to be true. It's something cited so often that it's essentially become a common truth. But we're going to go into the evidence for and against it today. In this video, I'm going to talk about my own personal thought process and the studies that convinced me and what I was doing at the time. But in another video later on, I might cover the evidence for and against more comprehensively, including some more recent evidence. So let me back up a bit and start at the beginning for me. I got my undergraduate degree in physics, my PhD in cognitive neuroscience, where I was looking at face processing in the human visual system. I actually tried to leave academia after my PhD because I wanted to work in a field that's more directly relevant to public health. And after applying to many postdoc positions, I got one at Wesleyan University studying addiction in the psychology department. And my advisor was interested in kind of common forms of addiction or the underlying addiction mechanism. Wasn't necessarily substance specific, but she was studying smoking in adolescents as an example of one of the most common addictions. So that's where I got my training in the field. I looked at nicotine dependence, the risk factors for smoking, how that whole process develops, and I was pretty prolifically publishing like 5 papers a year or so throughout this whole time. Eventually, I landed a faculty position, so I was a tenure-track assistant professor at the University of North Dakota. And when you're on the tenure track, you're told to specialize in one niche area of research and keep focusing on that, get grants, get publications until you get tenure, and then you can broaden your research goals and look at more things that interest you that might not be in the straight and narrow path. So I set out to continue that. I was continuing to publish on adolescent smoking as a common example of an addiction. And around 2014, e-cigarettes started getting a lot of attention in the field. So I'll go into that in a bit, but I was at UND for about 4 years, and then I spent 2 years at Stanford Research in South Dakota. And that was kind of a hybrid position where I could also work on research for the healthcare part of the organization. So in 2014 and 2015, when e-cigarettes started getting a lot of coverage, I initially bought into what I had heard about them at the time, which is that they're attractive to youth with their bright colors, flavors, and sometimes cartoons, that they have nicotine, which is highly addictive, and that they can act as a gateway to smoking among adolescents who try e-cigarettes. I had completely bought into that, as I mentioned. I'd never heard anything otherwise from either the academic literature or from the popular press, and I had no reason to question it. I knew about the supporting evidence for gateway, which is essentially that youth who use e-cigarettes are also more likely to smoke cigarettes, and frankly, it sounded plausible to me. And I knew the evidence wasn't concrete, but I had also kind of trusted in others in the field, and I assumed that people smarter than me had looked into this very closely, and if they were saying there was a gateway, then it seemed plausible to me. So what is the evidence for the gateway hypothesis? Essentially, it's based on one type of data, which is survey data. So you give surveys to a bunch of adolescents and you ask them about their substance use, including e-cigarettes and cigarette use, and maybe some other risk factors or personality characteristics or demographic characteristics. And the sole basis for the gateway claims are that e-cigarette use and cigarette use are correlated at the group level. In other words, adolescents who use e-cigarettes are also more likely to smoke cigarettes. But even then, it doesn't establish causality. It doesn't mean that the e-cigarette use caused them to go smoke. But nevertheless, I bought into Gateway at the time, and given the pressures of a tenure-track faculty member, I had to publish. On paper, 50% of my effort over the year was supposed to be devoted to research projects. In reality, my time looked a lot different, with most of my time being devoted to either teaching or mentoring master's students through their personal research projects. So research kind of got squashed, and I also had to split that between grant applications that ended up going nowhere and publications. But I was always good at publications. That was the one reliable thing that I could accomplish and count on for my annual reviews. So I set out to publish a pro-gateway paper. My plan for this paper was that I realized most of the existing gateway studies kind of stopped at showing what they thought was a gateway effect, and then in the discussion section they would speculate on the mechanism. In other words, how would the effect occur if there is an effect? And one of the common speculations was that it occurred through nicotine dependence. So adolescents who start using e-cigarettes become dependent on nicotine, and this spurs them to pick up cigarettes as well. And again, this seemed plausible for me. I wasn't questioning the existence of a gateway at this time. I just wanted to show the mechanism. So I thought I could be the first person to prove that a gateway effect could occur through the pathway of nicotine dependence. And if I could do this, this would fill an important gap in the literature and might get me a high-impact publication, which would count well for my annual reviews. So I had access to a great longitudinal data set that collected smoking behavior, e-cigarette use behavior, and nicotine dependence at multiple time points. I used a method that I really like called an autoregressive cross-lag model. And essentially what that means is each variable is allowed to predict itself over time, but you can also look at these cross-lagged effects and look at how one variable affects the other over time. What I expected to find was that e-cigarette use at one time point would increase nicotine dependence at the next time point, which would subsequently increase smoking behavior. So an indirect effect where e-cigarette use eventually affects smoking frequency, but it occurs through nicotine dependence. So these red highlights are my hypothesis and what I assumed I would find. But that's not what I found at all. E-cigarette use only has dotted lines, which means that it wasn't significantly associated with nicotine dependence or smoking behavior at the next time point. In fact, the main relationships here were smoking frequency predicting itself at the next time point and nicotine dependence predicting itself. E-cigarette use was affected by prior nicotine dependence and smoking behavior, but it didn't affect those. So in other words, e-cigarette use was only an effect, not a cause of the other variables in the model. And by the way, the thickness of the line corresponds to the strength or the effect size of the relationship. So e-cigarette use really wasn't having an effect on anything in the model except itself at a later time point. And if anything, there was evidence for the reverse direction, where smoking might impact e-cigarette use at a later time point. All in all, this really surprised me and failed to confirm my hypotheses because I didn't find any effect of e-cigarette use on smoking behavior, either directly or indirectly through nicotine dependence. In fact, smoking was the primary driver of that relationship. Nicotine dependence to an extent as well, but since only smoking affects nicotine dependence, the nicotine dependence is most likely from the cigarette smoking, not the e-cigarette use. At this point, this really put a crack in my worldview, and I wasn't really sure what to think at this point. On one hand, one valid criticism of this paper is that the participants were selected a few years earlier for being cigarette experimenters. The overall purpose of the larger study that I got this data from was to study the early stages of smoking experimentation and how that leads to more established use. So these participants mostly smoked first because this also started before e-cigarettes really became popular. So a valid criticism is that this isn't a true test of gateway because these people smoked first. And in some cases, they might have established smoking history before they ever tried an e-cigarette. So I thought, fair enough, but the results were so lacking with e-cigarette having any effect on the other variables that I did start to wonder, well, maybe what I've heard about gateway and e-cigarettes isn't true. Maybe that's not actually supported by the data. So the next couple of papers were to convince myself one way or the other. I started thinking, how else can I test this? How else can I test the gateway idea versus other competing explanations? And this was my next paper, which in some ways is kind of a sister paper to the first one I just showed you. It's from the same underlying study of young adults who were selected for experimental smoking and followed up longitudinally. So again, this couldn't be a true test of the gateway hypothesis, but I did do another analysis letting me look at just the association to see whether e-cigarettes were additive to smoking or whether they offset smoking. And here's the key result from that figure, which I'll explain. The y-axis, or the coefficient, is the strength of the association between whether they ever used e-cigarettes and the number of days that they smoked in the past 30 days. So above 0 means that if you ever used e-cigarettes, you tend to smoke more frequently. If the confidence interval crosses 0, as it does for most of this plot, it means that there's no significant effect. And if it's less than 0, it means that if you ever used e-cigarettes, you smoke less frequently out of the past month. And the x-axis here, it's not time, and the x-axis here is nicotine dependence score, with higher numbers being more severe nicotine dependence. So overall, what this is showing is that for most people in this study that had either low or moderate levels of nicotine dependence, whether they ever tried e-cigarettes was unrelated to how frequently they smoke. But for those with the very highest levels of nicotine dependence, they actually smoked less frequently if they ever used e-cigarettes. And again, this isn't a perfect study. It's not a true test of gateway because many of these people were already smoking first. And the measures that I used were kind of crude, so like ever used e-cigarettes isn't really a valuable measure because it doesn't say whether they were still using e-cigarettes and whether they definitively displaced some of their smoking with e-cigarettes. But what it does show more broadly is it falls down on one side of the explanation rather than the other. So if there were a gateway effect, generally what you'd find is that any amount of e-cigarette use increases the level of smoking. But here it was the opposite. There was some evidence for displacement. So at this point I took a step back and started looking into other explanations for what could explain the gateway evidence if there isn't a gateway. And I went back to the old marijuana or cannabis gateway idea. The original literature argues that alcohol and tobacco use start first, and this is followed by cannabis use, and then this leads to harder or illicit drugs. But this was based on the same type of evidence, essentially conflating causality with correlation. Researchers eventually realized that just because somebody uses cannabis, it doesn't mean that causes them to use other illicit drugs. It's more likely that there's an underlying common liability or an underlying propensity for using substances. So people who use marijuana and illicit drugs might have gone on to use illicit drugs anyway, regardless of whether they use marijuana to begin with. And it's the same situation here. If there's an underlying propensity for nicotine use, then it doesn't mean that e-cigarette use caused somebody to go smoke. It meant that the person was likely to seek out nicotine based on pre-existing factors like propensity for risk-taking, maybe mental health status, environmental status, like whether your family or friends use substances. And this is the common liability explanation, essentially saying that pre-existing factors jointly influence whether somebody's likely to use e-cigarettes and cigarettes as separate effects of the same underlying cause, rather than e-cigarette use causing somebody to go on to smoke. And of course, the studies that conclude in favor of a gateway do understand that there's common risk factors that need to be accounted for, but the problem is they're not doing a very thorough job of accounting for all these other explanations. And there's a review of the literature on this. This is a bit older of a review, but it does capture most of the landmark gateway studies that are still cited today as evidence for gateway. And what it found is that essentially there's dozens of common risk factors that explain why somebody who uses e-cigarettes is also more likely to smoke. It doesn't mean that it's a gateway. In fact, it means that there's prior indicators of tendencies to go on to smoke even before someone started using e-cigarettes. The problem with the existing research is that all studies account for some of the common risk factors, such as sociodemographics like age, sex, race, ethnicity, maybe income. But all gateway studies are critically lacking many of the other categories, such as personality traits that might predispose someone to taking risks, or mental health status. There's dozens of risk factors overall, and there are no studies that have accounted for all of the risk factors. Essentially what this means is that what appears to be and what is reported to be a gateway association between e-cigarettes and cigarettes is at least partially and maybe fully due to these underlying common liability factors. So in my next study, I set out to look at this confounding by common liability issue. And I thought, what if I can better account for common liability factors and see what happens to what's being interpreted as a gateway association? And my approach here was twofold. First, I wanted to account for as many covariates or common liability factors as were available in the dataset. But second, and maybe more importantly, I wanted to use a more refined methodology. The standard way of doing this is to have a regression with e-cigarette use as the predictor, smoking as the outcome, and then you put in covariates for common liability factors, which is supposed to remove the effect of any confounding factors in order to isolate an effect of e-cigarette use and try to find the unique portion of e-cigarette use that explains smoking behavior. But this standard method can be biased when you have very different groups that you're comparing. And it is true that non-users look very different from the group that use either e-cigarettes or smoking, who look a lot more like each other. So if you're comparing apples and oranges like this traditional statistics isn't a great way of removing all the confounding. I used a more advanced method called inverse propensity weighting, which I won't get into too much here, but it does do a better job of adjusting for the confounding factors. Here's what I found. The red bars are the unadjusted associations between e-cigarette use and smoking. And by unadjusted, I mean it doesn't account for any of the shared risk factors. So that, as you might expect, is very high, with high odds ratios. Once I do the standard method, which is still flawed, you can see how much the odds ratio decreases, which means that the apparent gateway association becomes a lot weaker as you account for the common liability factors. And you might even say that common liability factors account for most of what appears to be the original gateway association. Then when I do the further step of using inverse propensity weights, that number comes down even more. In some cases, it's non-significant. The results fell into two buckets here because I had different combinations of how to measure e-cigarette use and smoking. So when I looked at outcomes of current smoking, those results were non-significant, meaning that of the large initial apparent gateway association, all of it was explained by shared risk factors. There might be an effect with ever smoking. So I can't rule out an effect that using e-cigarettes might cause someone to try cigarettes. But the important thing is that for current smoking, which is more relevant from a public health perspective, there was no effect. There was no remaining association with gateway. For ever smoking, there might or might not be a causal effect. So the study did not collect every possible confounder, so I know that some of this remaining association is due to residual confounding, but I'm not sure how much. There might be a causal effect on experimentation, but the important thing is that it's restricted to experimentation and not ongoing use. The health effects from pure experimentation that doesn't continue are negligible. So overall, this also argues against the gateway hypothesis because I was not able to find a consistent, unique effect of e-cigarettes once I did a really good job of adjusting for the other common liability factors. So at this point in my career, it was starting to appear to me that gateway was less and less supported by the evidence. But I realized that I needed even more. I needed to look at this in different ways, because most of what I had done, and actually most of what Gateway is based on, is individual level analyses of survey data. And there's been this great meta-analysis commentary by some prominent researchers arguing for many lines of evidence. So in other words, survey evidence has consistent flaws and strengths, and other lines of evidence might have their own strengths and weaknesses, but when you evaluate everything together, you can kind of comprehensively evaluate whether there's converging lines of evidence or not. So then I started thinking about population trends as a different way to test this gateway versus common liability question. And I realized that if a gateway is occurring, it would predict logically that there's higher smoking rates as e-cigarette use rises, because e-cigarette use is causing more people to smoke when there otherwise would be less. And the important thing about this question is that it's relative to a counterfactual or a hypothetical world without e-cigarettes. And just a quick note that you can still have a gateway if smoking rates are falling in the absolute sense, because if the decline of smoking slowed down as a result of e-cigarettes, then that would still be like an opposition effect from e-cigarettes, and that would be consistent with a gateway. So the thing that really matters here is comparing what we actually see in smoking compared to what we would have otherwise expected in a hypothetical world. So I went to NYTS, or National Youth Tobacco Survey trends in the US, going back from about 1999 or 2000. So this shows data from the National Youth Tobacco Survey, or NYTS. The yellow dotted line shows the actual smoking trends. So they had been declining before e-cigarettes came onto the market ever since 1999 or so. And if I take those declines and project them into the future, you get the blue line here, which is our counterfactual scenario. So this is what hypothetically would have happened to smoking rates if everything had continued uninterrupted from before 2010. But you see that actual smoking rates are much lower than this counterfactual. And this was a simulation model. So when I modeled gateway in the red, that vastly overpredicts the number of adolescents who smoke. And even the diversion scenario, at least in the initial form that I tested it in the simulation model, even that slightly overpredicts the actual prevalence of youth smoking. So what that meant is I really had to crank up the diversion effect to better replicate real data. Overall, what this is showing is that youth smoking rates declined so much more than we would have expected based on the pre-2010 trends. And gateway scenario in particular is really, really inconsistent with what we see in the real world. If anything, the trends are much more consistent with the diversion effect. An important caveat is I can't prove the diversion effect any more than the opposite would prove a gateway effect, but what I can evaluate is that the predictions of gateway are very, very inconsistent with real data. Even the null hypothesis that e-cigarettes have nothing to do with smoking rates, even that vastly overpredicts the actual smoking prevalence that we see. And the only scenario that adequately explains the large declines in youth smoking is the diversion scenario. Now, some of this might have been due to policies passed since then, but in my own estimation, which I'll talk about in a forthcoming video in more detail, I don't think the policy effects can account for the magnitude of this decline. Backing up to the personal perspective here, at this point I had published a couple of what I thought were very impactful and very interesting papers that should have invited a lot of discussion and future research among my academic colleagues. But I've really felt that my work was getting ignored. I would offer to collaborate with people that believed in Gateway, and none of that ever went anywhere. My papers were not really being cited. So I felt like the field as a whole was just ignoring my papers rather than facing some hard discussions about the evidence and the theories that they were supporting. Also, having a fairly favorable stance towards e-cigarettes did contribute, at least in part, to my inability to get grants for my research, which is a huge requirement in academia these days in order to advance to a more senior position or even hold your current position. So at this point, I had published a couple of pro-tobacco harm reduction papers on e-cigarettes, and the only attention I was getting was from the industry. And when the opportunity to consult first came up, I wanted to do it morally and academically. I thought it was the right thing to do, but I knew that any hint of industry connection is immediately and forever toxic. I knew that my academic colleagues would not take my work seriously ever again if I consulted for industry. But ultimately, I realized, what did I have to lose in academia? I already wasn't getting grants. I could publish prolifically, but that only gets you so far. I wasn't getting engagement from my colleagues that I thought the work deserved. So I realized I didn't have anything to lose in academia, and ultimately I did accept the consulting position that I'm in right now. And sort of ironically, at least to some, I felt like I could do more good for public health by consulting for an e-cigarette company than I ever could in academia. So I think I'll end the video here, but I wanted to walk through my own personal story of why I started out buying into the gateway and buying into all the alarmism around e-cigarettes, and how I changed my mind with my own research. With respect to the gateway hypothesis, that e-cigarette use causally increases smoking, this is based on unreliable data and it misrepresents correlation as causation. Nevertheless, unfortunately, scientific and news articles continue to claim or imply gateway. They've gotten a lot more careful in their wording recently to say youth who try e-cigarettes are 3 times more likely to smoke cigarettes, that sort of thing. So they're not using explicit causal language, but the implication is still there. And I should take a moment to state the obvious, that underage youth should not be using any substances. They shouldn't be vaping, they shouldn't be smoking. I'm obviously not recommending that they start any of these products, but in reality they do, and I think public health should face that reality. Public health should educate them about the relative risks if they choose to engage in that behavior, same as educating on safe sex if they choose to engage in that, or wearing helmets if they decide to go out riding a bike. So that's it for today. I just wanted to walk everybody through the exact details of how I went from buying into the gateway hypothesis to rejecting it and realizing that, if anything, e-cigarettes are displacing cigarette smoking, no matter how you look at it. Stay tuned for future videos where I'll give a more comprehensive and objective overview of the evidence for and against gateway. Thanks for your attention, and let me know if you have any suggestions or comments down below.